Awesome. All right, everyone. Well, welcome to End-to-End Testing Mobile Apps with Ionic and Cypress. So as Mike said, I am Cecelia Martinez. I am a success engineer at Cypress. I am in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm not from here, but love it here now, so it's my new home. In addition to the work that I do with Cypress, I also really like to be involved in the tech community and volunteer. I am a track evangelist with Women Who Code Front End, and I'm also on the leadership team for Out in Tech and help to found the Atlanta chapter. If you would like to reach out to me, if you have any questions, I promise I'm very friendly, maybe just a little busy, but feel free to say hi. I am on Twitter at Cecelia Creates, and you can also find me on GitHub at Cecelia Creates or Cypress Cecelia. So talking a little bit about what Cypress is, for those of you that aren't familiar, Cypress is a free and open source test runner. It runs in a browser right alongside your application code. It's primarily used for end-to-end testing. You can do a lot of things with it, however. If you are already familiar with Mocha, Chai, and jQuery, then you have a head start because all of those libraries are built into Cypress. It also has built-in waits and retries when querying for elements and also making assertions on those elements, which can help reduce the flake in your test suite. There are a number of debugging tools available within the test runner that make it a little bit easier to identify why your tests are failing. These include a time travel feature that allows you to step through the different commands of your test. We have improved error reporting. This is actually a newer feature that came out recently where we actually show you the stack trace for the failure and where in your code base the code is that's triggering the failure. It also allows you to see screenshots and videos of your test runs, and you can also set screenshots to occur either on failure or at certain points throughout your test if you need to see what's happening behind the scenes. And then because it runs alongside your code, it also allows you to have a lot of control over your test environment. So you can do things like set the viewport for the browser that you're running your test in. You can access and set application state. And you can also simulate different types of movements that a user would make. So for example, you can simulate swiping through on a mobile device. You can simulate things like drag and drop, file uploads, different things of that nature. So I'm sure one of the questions is mobile testing in a browser, right? Doesn't necessarily immediately make sense. But with Ionic, when mobile development happens in a browser, why not? And this is where kind of the magic when you combine Ionic and Cypress happens, where it allows you to actually do full end-to-end testing on your application, make sure all the functionality is working, go through the same journey that your user would go through early on in the development process. So some of the benefits of combining Ionic and Cypress for your mobile development testing is that you don't need device-specific configurations. So if you've ever tried to set up React Native and Android Studio and all of that stuff, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not exactly beginner-friendly. It's not exactly user-friendly experience. Like I mentioned before, you can also access and manipulate app state. And you can develop and test in the same language. So Cypress is built on JavaScript, JavaScript-like the syntax. And so if you're already familiar with one of the JavaScript frameworks, which if you're using Ionic, you probably are, if you're a web dev moving into mobile development. So you can kind of have the same language and the same knowledge base across your development, your QA team, or both, if you are doing both across your teams. Of course, there are some limitations. So because you're testing in a browser and not on a native device, you can't directly test native device functionality. So things like if you needed to test a camera or a fingerprint, anything that would require a real physical mobile device, you can't test for that functionality. Also, we're mimicking a mobile experience by setting a viewport. So the tests are running in a browser, and we're custom setting the viewport to be a mobile viewport. So we can see how the test runs, we can see that viewport, but if there's certain limitations that come from being on a mobile device, you wouldn't necessarily be able to test for those edge cases. So just wanted to cover some of the different situations that you might run into. So getting started and taking a look at some actual code, I'm going to be using the Ionic Conference app for this talk. It is an app designed by and coded by the Ionic team, and it essentially functions to show all the different things that Ionic can do, right? So it's an application, a practical preview of the Ionic framework in action. So it has a lot of different functionalities available. So I figured it would be a good playground to come in and write some tests. And it is open source. You can clone the repository, and it's built with Ionic and Angular. So that's exactly what I did. Essentially, clone the repository, and then within the root directory of that project, you're going to want to install Cypress. So you can do this directly with just npm install Cypress, and then you can save it as a dev dependency. Once you do that, a few things are going to happen. The first time that you install Cypress and then run the command npx cypress open, it's going to essentially set up a couple of different files and folders within your project. So it sets up a Cypress folder that has a few different files and folders inside of it. The first is your fixtures folder. This is where you can store data, data sets, different files and information that you can leverage within your testing. The integration folder is where we actually keep all the test specs. There is a plugins folder if you are using any of the third-party plugins. So Cypress does have it is open source. So, our test runner is open source. So you have a pretty robust community with some third-party plugins that you can leverage. And then in the support folder is where you will keep any essentially custom commands, any side commands that you're using within your test suite. And we will actually use some custom commands during this talk. So we'll demonstrate how that works. The other thing that it's going to do is it's going to set up a cypress.json file on the root of your project. So this is the Cypress configuration file. This is where you can do all kinds of different configurations, but the one that we definitely recommend as a best practice is setting a base URL in your cypress.json file. So this is the URL where the local instance of your app is running. So you do, in my case, my Ionic conference app is currently running on localhost 8100. Might not be the case for you. So if you just want to make sure that that's going to match up with wherever the app is that you're going to be testing against. And as I said, when it comes time to actually run the tests, so after you've written them all up and are ready to see if they turn green, you will start by launching the app. So Ionic serve is the command to create a local development instance of the application. And then you're going to also launch Cypress. So in a separate terminal, you're going to launch npx cypress open, and that's going to essentially open up the test runner. And so npx cypress open is open mode with the test runner. And that's going to essentially open up in a new window, and we'll demonstrate what that looks like a little bit in just here a little bit. All right, so diving into some test code and talking about the basic test structure. So again, if you're familiar with Mocha, the test runner, the syntax will look very familiar to you. So essentially, you have your describe block. You can leverage Mocha hooks like before each, before, after, and after each. In this case, I'm using the before each hook to use the sci.viewport command, which is a Cypress command that allows you to set the viewport. Makes sense. And then right after that, in the first if block, it's just essentially visiting the site. So sci.visit, again, as you can probably guess, it just visits a URL. So here we just have the slash. And because we set the base URL in our cypress.json file, it's just going to visit our home page. So that allows you to not have to retype your home URL over and over and over again by having it in the cypress.json. So if we take a look at what a critical path user flow might look like. So not even knowing at this point what the application does, you haven't seen it, you haven't even looked at the code, you don't really know anything about it. If we were to read through these test cases, just by reading through the Cypress code, you can kind of get a sense of what it does and what the user would do and what's happening in these tests. So initially, when you first log into the app, like many apps, it has a tutorial that happens the first time you load. You swipe through it, and then after you've completed it, it takes you to the actual application. Because of this, in order to kind of manage the tests to make sure that we're seeing that tutorial when we want to and not seeing it when we don't want to, we're using a custom command here. So the sci.enable tutorial is actually a custom command that we're going to take a look at in just a moment, but that we've written and then we've stored in our support files that we can then pull it into our test. So in this case, we're enabling the tutorial, making sure that we see it. We're swiping left 3 times. And again, swipe left is also a custom command. And then essentially sci.contains is a query. It's a query that is going to search for any element that contains the text continue. And then it's going to click that element, so .click. So essentially you can kind of picture, all right, we enabled the tutorial, swipe left 3 times, look for something that says continue, and then we click on it. Pretty straightforward. The next section, the next if block there is adds a session from the list to favorites. So again, we're using our custom command. This time we're disabling the tutorial because we want to ensure that we're bypassing the tutorial. It doesn't make sense to have to swipe left 3 times every single if block. So by manipulating the state of the application, we can bypass it directly and get right to what we actually want to test. In this case, we are querying for an element that contains, contains the text University of Ionic. And once we find that element, we are clicking on it. Next, the next line, sci.get, this is another type of query. Instead of querying for text, you can pass through any kind of selector. So if you're familiar with jQuery, you can query by element, HTML element. You can do a class selector and you would use the dot. If you do an ID, you would use a hashtag. So in this case, I am actually using an HTML data attribute, which is one of our recommended best practices. So I'm using the data sci attribute to set this field and to be able to query it directly. So in this case, we are querying for an HTML element that has a data sci attribute of favorite, and we're clicking it. We are then querying for an element with a data sci attribute of back and clicking it. And then we are again searching for an element that contains the text favorites and clicking it. And last but not least, we're just searching for an element that contains the text University of Ionic. So you notice that this last test, there's one thing you're probably noticing is that there's not any assertions, right? So I'm not stating sci.dot contains University of Ionic and then saying this element should exist or this element should be this, right? This is just a very simple user, critical path user flow of what a user would do and making sure that all the elements are there, because the Cypress commands are all self-asserting. So if sci.dot contains searches for an element that has the text University of Ionic and it doesn't find it, the test will fail. So I don't necessarily need to have a separate assertion if I'm just wanting to verify that element is there. By using the Cypress command, it will verify itself and the test will pass as long as it exists on the page. So not to be too repetitive, but two more examples of some different test cases that we're going to use here to demonstrate our critical path is the Ionic app. The conference app does have dark mode. So I wanted to confirm that this works. So again, we're disabling the tutorial. We're then doing a query for an HTML element with a data sci attribute of menu, and we're clicking on it. We're then querying for an element with a data sci attribute of dark mode, and we're clicking on it. And then this is where we actually are making an assertion. So I'm looking for text. I'm querying for text that contains the phrase dark mode, and it should have CSS color, and then we have the RGB code pass through. So essentially, I'm just confirming that the CSS has updated after we toggle the dark mode switch. And then last but not least, it searches for a session and adds to favorites. So again, we're disabling the tutorial. We're querying for a couple of elements here. First is going to have a data attribute of search. We're clicking on it. We're then getting the search bar, clicking on it, and we're directly typing in Angular and hitting enter. So this is all done within Cypress. Sci.dot contains, we're then looking for the text Angular directives and clicking on it. And then we're going to favorite that. We're going to click back. We're going to look for favorites again, click on it. And again, this is a self-asserting command of sci.dot contains Angular directives. And what that's doing is confirming that that text does appear in our favorites list after we click the favorites button. Okay, so what does this actually look like when we're running these tests? So I have a video, but hopefully we don't need it. So this is what the test runner looks like. And you can see these are the different spec files that we have. So we're just going to take a look at what the critical path looks like. So if we click on that, it opens up a browser and it starts running through these tests. So we can see on the left-hand side, we have what we call the command log, which just shows the commands as they're running. And on the right-hand side, you can see our actual application. And so we can see everything running through and we can see all the tests have passed. And we will dive into the more specifics as we move along. So going back to our presentation, give me one moment here. There we go. Okay, so we did a couple of things in that test that I want to talk about more specifically. First thing we talked about was setting the viewport. So this is what actually allows you to have that kind of like mobile testing magic, right? Because we can simulate a mobile viewport in the browser. There's a few different ways to do this. If you are going to always use the same height and width across your entire test suite for your project, you can set that right in your cypress.json file. So in the same place where you set your base URL, you can set the viewport height and viewport width. Another option is to use the sci.viewport command. So this is what we saw in the test that we just ran. You can pass a couple things through sci.viewport. You can either pass through the height and width. You can also pass through, we have a number of preset devices. So in this case, I'm using iPhone 5 to run all the tests. You can also pass through whether it's going to be landscape or portrait mode. Default is portrait mode, and that's what we're using here. As I mentioned before, you can also use a before each hook. So for example, if you had one spec file of desktop tests and another spec file of your mobile tests, and you wanted all the mobile tests to run within the sci.viewport iPhone 5, then you could use that in a before each hook, so you don't have to set it manually. Otherwise, you could use it individually throughout individual tests if you needed to change something ad hoc. Okay, so I want to give a quick demo of what it looks like when changing the viewport kind of middle of the way through. So the first set of tests that's running here are desktop tests. They do not have a viewport set. And you can see it's kind of the full size of the application. You can see the menu is a little bit different when it's not in mobile view. It's actually shown the entire time. So this is going to be a very different type of user flow and test, and different elements are going to be visible at different times. The next section here is our mobile tests, which do have a sci.viewport in the before each hook. So we can see that the viewport has now changed to mimic the iPhone 5 device, and the tests all run again, but within that mobile type of environment. Okay, great. So going back here. So that's how you update the viewport. Let's talk a little bit about app storage. This is actually really interesting. So Ionic has its own built-in free and open source storage option called Ionic Storage. It's very easy to use. That's what I personally used. It was built into the conference app, and I decided to use it for my tests as well. So the nice thing about Cypress, again, is that since it's built on top of JavaScript, you can import different packages, you can import modules, you can import functions that you would want to use for your test code. So just taking a look at Ionic Storage first, essentially it works by importing storage, creating a new instance of that, and then you're using the methods set and get to set storage and also get values. Pretty straightforward. What this looks like, so for example, in the conference app, there is a field called Ion did tutorial, and that field, whether it's true or false, controls whether or not the tutorial is displayed when you open the application. And that's the field that we're going to be manipulating in our tests. So we've created a custom command here. And again, these custom commands are in your support/commands.js file. They're automatically imported to your test code. And in this case, within this file, we're importing storage and we're creating a new instance of it. And then we're adding a custom command. So in this case, it's cypress.commands.add. So we're adding a command called enable tutorial, which does a sci.visit to our home page. But before it loads, so on before load, it sets the storage for Ion did tutorial to false. So before the page loads, it sets the storage Ion did tutorial to false. That way, it will always show the tutorial. So by using this command, throughout our test, we can control whether or not the tutorial is going to be shown. So once we have this command written and in our commands folder, we can use it within our test code. So for example, in our initial app, we have enable tutorial, swipe left 3 times, and then click on the application. We can see this in the test runner. So I have it set up to pause. What's happened is we've enabled tutorial, so we've run that command. And if we take a look at our application storage, so the nice thing about the Cypress test runner is you can still access all of the dev tools and everything that you would in a normal browser. We can see here that Ion did tutorial is set to false. If we resume the test, we've now set it up to disable the tutorial, so it progresses directly to the application without having to swipe through. And again, if we're looking at our storage here, we can refresh and see that Ion did tutorial is now set to true. So at any point in our test, we can directly control the state of our application in order to manipulate the environment and set it up so that we can get right to where we want to test. All right, so the next custom command I want to take a look at is Cypress custom commands for swiping like a user. So again, we're adding a command, so cypress.commands.add swipe left. And this is being built on top of the existing drag and drop example for Cypress. And what it's doing is it's actually triggering mouse down, mouse move, and mouse up elements in order to simulate, touching on a device, sliding your thumb across, and lifting up as if you were swiping. So in this case, it's getting the swiper element. It's triggering a mouse down on the right-hand side. It's moving the mouse to the left, and then it's raising the mouse, which again simulates a swiping motion. And then once we have that defined, we can use it in our test. So let's take a look and see what that looks like in the test runner. Okay, so we have our tutorial. We have it in the viewport. And then if we resume the test, we can see it swiping through. So if I hover over in the command log, oh, sorry, I can't do that until I run through. We can see them all swiping through and then hitting left. And then if I hover over in the command log, you can kind of see this red dot. And then it's swiping over and it's releasing. And that's what's triggering and mimicking that swipe motion. So you can actually do things. So if you had different types of things that you had to touch on your application or move around, you could simulate those types of movements within Cypress. So let's kind of talk about putting it all together, right? So we talked about how to install Cypress. We talked about the file structure, your cypress.json file, which is your configuration file, setting up the base URL, getting to a mobile testing environment by setting the viewport in your browser for your tests. We talked about Cypress custom commands and how we can use those to essentially not have to rewrite or manipulate the code over and over again. Instead, we can just write a command and use it repeatedly throughout our code. In this case, we had a custom command to enable and disable the tutorial for the application. We also had a custom command to simulate swipe functionality. And then we also talked about what a critical user path looks like and running through all those different tests. So yeah, it's coming in a couple minutes left. So I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to view this presentation. It's definitely very beginner friendly. So I hope that everyone feels comfortable maybe going on and playing with some of these tests yourself. So the repository that I shared today with all the tests that are written is available online. It's on github.com/CeceliaCreates/Cypress And you can take a look at all the different custom commands and tests that I demonstrated here today. And you can also see the clone that I did of the Ioniconf app that has some of the data attributes set for testing. And as always, please feel free to reach out to me, Cecelia Creates on Twitter, and I'm at CeceliaCreates.com. And if you want to learn more about Cypress, like I said, it is free, it's open source, you can get started with it right away. Cypress.io is the place to go, and we have some very excellent documentation. I'm not responsible for it, so I feel like I can say that. So it's just really easy to kind of get in and start learning if you're already familiar with some JavaScript. So yeah, thanks to everyone for the time today, and I'll pass it back to Mike.